Thanks a lot and good morning, everyone. This is a presentation that has been actually an opportunity for some thinking. So as always, these things oblige you to push forward your thinking, but it's not giving any big answer, but actually I would like to use this also to open the conversation. So the topic is designing for and within care ecosystems, and somehow at the end there is this question that I would also like to open up. So what does it mean, and the role of design moving from prototypes to proto-institutions. I am Daniela Sangiorgi. I'm associate professor at the design department of design of Politecnico di Milano, and I'm here with Serpil.
Hello everyone, I'm Sultan Erdönmez. I'm a PhD student in Politecnico di Milano in design department and working with Daniela.
Okay, so this presentation, there is a mixed audience, is trying to be grounded on a specific project that is now at these last days, which is called Recovery Net, and is a project in the Lombardy region of Italy, which is specifically about redesigning, transforming the mental health care ecosystem. So this is was a starting opportunity to look through this a bit deeper in a specific part of this project. This project, as I was saying, is funded by Fondazione Cariplo and is a 3 years project, which aim is to transform the mental health care ecosystem toward recovery and co-production, in particular the idea of developing a community-based psychiatry, which is grounded and supported by the collaboration of different kinds of local actors. I will do this presentation with a bit of story about the project and then some key terms that somehow has led the project. One of these is the concept of recovery that maybe you're familiar with, which is one of the key concepts which was informing this recovery.net. Which is a concept that's trying to communicate a different paradigm in care in mental health care. So moving from clinical recovery, which is focused on the full clinical recovery of a person from a medical perspective, to a personal recovery, which is instead a more deeply personal process of transformation, where even with the limitations caused by the illness, a person can still live a full and hopeful and contributing life. So this means that there is a development of the meaning and purpose in one's life, but also a different understanding somehow of mental health. Recovery is strongly connected with another concept, which is co-production. And co-production involves the evolution of citizen from being a passive recipient of the clinical treatment, let's say, to an active participant. In mental health care, this means not only participating to delivering, co-delivering certain kind of initiative and service within institutional services, but also to co-design, participate in the co-design of new services or redesign of services, and also the fundamental role that a group of citizens like patients association or family members associations or local group of citizens can have in supporting mental health as a public value, let's say. Furthermore, this project has been also linked to another concept, which is actually the concept of care ecosystem. And I leave the floor to Serpil.
Okay, thanks. And while we are talking about the mental health care, it's actually important to use the concept of the care ecosystem concept instead of the healthcare ecosystem concept, because it's important to recognize the roles that are divided into different actors, such as the health and social care providers, family members, third sector associations, industry, citizen groups, and etc. And care ecosystem has been defined as a dynamic and co-evolving communities composed of different actors creating and capturing new value through both collaboration and computation. And the concept of the ecosystem actually comes from the biological ecosystem, which has been used as a metaphor to explain like what happens in the organization ecosystem. Why? Because it explains and categorizes the complexities that shape and sustain organizational ecosystem. And the metaphor of the biological ecosystem has been applied to these organizational studies, informing concepts like business ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, digital ecosystem, and service ecosystem, and particularly care ecosystem. And we are using ecosystem as a metaphor because this metaphor that comes from the biological ecosystem offers and explains some of these key qualities, and these key qualities actually helps us to understand the organizational ecosystem. Like the concept of hierarchy, the way it's about the way of actors use the resources according to the organizational level, and the actors means that human and non-human organizations in the ecosystem. Dynamic is about the transformation of the ecosystem that is able to adapt and change in the condition through this self-regulating, self-sustaining, and interaction actually is about the flow of resources and the information between the actors and the organizations. And in particularly, it's the ability of coalition is about the interdependence way of evolving in time. That is the result of working competitively and collaboratively, which that supports this coalition in somehow with overall the organization ecosystem. And this concept, these qualities actually are relevant, are particularly relevant while if we are studying the care ecosystem. Because by using the ecosystem as a metaphor, we are learning these different qualities that can help us to understand how this system works. And these qualities actually can be found in the description of the care ecosystem, like the care ecosystem defined as a dynamic and co-evolving community that is composed of sovereign and unique organization, independent care providers, informal caregivers, care networks, patient funders, regulatory agencies, and others. And all these actors are participating, which co-produce care or develop care innovations. And these are related to a specific or multiple patient populations through the various level of collaboration, computation, and dependence and independence, and operating with unique social, physical, and systematic conditions. And Daniela will continue.
Yeah, thanks. So these three concepts somehow has been informing the project Recovery Name. So the importance of developing a psychiatric model oriented to the principles of recovery and co-production. On the other side, the idea of trying to form a new local governance that manage a local care ecosystem that was able to manage care pathways that were centered on personal, co-produced, integrated care. This project was carried out by a wide set of actors, 2 departments of mental health, 3 universities, 1 of design, 1 of sociology, and 1 of psychology, some local cooperatives and associations, a theater company, and a patient, family member, 2 family member associations. This project, with this idea of trying to have this more ecosystem perspective, has taken a multidisciplinary, multi-level approach. So the idea was trying to identify and develop actions from an individual level, a service and organizational level, systemic level, and then a more societal perspective. So, for example, at the individual level, these 3 territories involved in the project were activating individual treatment plans using a specific tool, which is called the Mental Health Recovery Star, which is a fundamental tool of transformation at individual level, because somehow create this practice of co-producing a care plan together between the user and the practitioner, following the principles of the 10 areas that are connected to the principles of recovery. Another aspect, instead more at the service level, there were some key innovative co-produced service models that we aim to introduce in these different areas. For example, a more established one, which is the Recovery College, which is a training program which is co-produced by user operators and local community, which is trying to mix both the experiential knowledge and professional knowledge coming from these teams. The other level is more the systemic one, and for example, at this level, there was this kind of approach to mapping resource in the territory, which is called dynamic mapping, which came from the University of Bicocca Sociology Department, which created different groups where they were mixing user, relatives, and professional to select together different realities of the territory with the aim of activating opportunity for their life projects of patients, but also opening up to the territory. And then at the fourth level, there was this idea to activate societal change by developing cultural initiatives, also beyond trying to engage with the institutional actors, to promote a different understanding of mental health. For example, with this theater festival called Metamorphosis. Within this project, there was also a specific role of design. We also participate in other levels, but in particular, we had a role to facilitate the co-design of free recovery collabs in Lombardy, which were intended both as physical and virtual places because of the advent of COVID as well, which were to be placed outside institutional services to facilitate co-creation initiatives and opportunities with and on the territory. And in particular, the aim of the collab was to behave like an engine, a transformational engine that should open the way to involve in a different way this wide range of territorial actors of this, let's say, care ecosystem, to rethink also the institutional governance that would move from a provider-centric toward a more community paradigm. To do this, we first kind of conceptual, theoretical perspective was the idea that we were aiming toward an hybrid kind of lab. So we were aware that there are very different kind of labs in the world, and the idea was try to take something interesting from three kinds of labs. One is called general innovation labs, which is generally within organization to inform service innovation organizational change. But we were also interested in living labs because they generally operate in the territory, experimenting with territorial actors to develop new solutions. So also in the implementations part. But also there was something interesting from community hubs, which were more oriented towards social inclusion and cohesion and bottom-up service change. So the idea was to try to take from all these different labs something interesting. The other aspect is that we were aware that as natural ecosystems are emerging, like Serpil was saying, is a dynamic, co-evolving set of actors. And so they go beyond somehow the control of individuals. But there is, as we know, within institutional theory, the possibility for individuals to have a potential influence, at least partially, to transform ecosystem, reconfiguring the institutional arrangements that somehow constrains the service ecosystem. To do this, we agree somehow with the idea that we can't really kind of design ecosystem, but we can support their evolution by building collaborative capacity. So somehow engaging different ecosystem actors in co-exploring, understanding each other's aspiration, needs, and opportunities and strengths, and somehow create the condition for a different kind of cultural collaboration through activating possible initiatives like pilots, experimental initiatives, and so on. And doing this through co-design, which somehow is intended, therefore, as a prototype of the future collab. So by doing this process of co-designing, we are somehow suggesting how the collab should work in the future. And we know that co-design is also considered as a possible way to create different partnerships, to challenge traditional power relations shed light on existing dynamics and mental model, and so somehow support this kind of institutional work that we were talking about before. So this process therefore developed from the identification of possible territorial places where to set up these labs. We had one workshop which was common across the 3 territories, and then we had 2 workshops in each location where these general ideas were then located in specific contexts. This presentation is focused specifically on one of these collabs, which is in a lab in Brescia, which for certain conditions, also historical condition, which was more kind of connection with the topics of the project, has managed now to be implemented and starting to have some possibility of a future development. So as you can see from the first line is the activity we did across the different territories, and then below you find the specific activity we did within the territory of Brescia. So from studying the local context and then organizing more dedicated workshops. So the first workshop, which was transversal, was doing what I said before, to find this hybrid idea of a lab. So taking something from the innovation lab, from community apps and living labs. So there was this exercise to find which aspects of these labs we would like to take and develop. Out of this, we developed some scenarios which were more abstract and meta level. And during a second workshop, we brought this scenario within the specific context of Brescia. In particular, we chose an area which is a bit contradictory and full of somehow societal issues because of the presence of different kind of populations, and in particular from an urban design perspective is made also a mix of villas and these big towers, which is quite contested in the local area. And we actually chose to have a space within one of these towers. The scenario that is emerged is this idea of a collab, which was a space oriented toward the topic of mental health, but it is but should be linked with the different actors in the area. And by doing this dynamic mapping of the territory, it could propose interventions and collaboration. And by doing this interaction, somehow the place is in constant transformation. So this idea of a place that somehow is creating constant links and collaboration, but by doing this is somehow becoming hybrid place, was somehow at the beginning of this process. And we also identify some main areas like entertaining activities, orienting activities, training activity, and design activity that could happen with this place. The third workshop then brought these scenarios, integrated them in one vision, and started to reflect on details of these possible initiatives, and then how this initiative could be translated in the reorganization of the space that was identified within the tower. This led then to imagine how the space could be used and the layout, the different purchasing of the furnishing of the space, which was then going through a long process of refurbishing because they found security issues in all the tower actually. So they had to do a lot of work, which took a lot of months. And then we had COVID. So there was a big and long period of almost inactivity apart from online activities, which really challenged the development of this experience. But luckily, let's say in summer 2022, 2021, people of the organizing collab started to use the space, and there was a launch, official launch, the 1st October of 2021. So somehow design at this point, our role gradually diminished because our idea was to design ourselves out of these initiatives. But because of this seminar, but also because we are coming to the end of the project, we need to do some of the evaluations for the Fondazione Cariplo. This was a first opportunity to start asking some questions. One question is this recovery collab actually helping to transform the local care ecosystem and also somehow recovery net that converge into the specific place? And then second is if this local prototype of the recovery collab has the potential affecting the wider institutional field of mental health care. So for addressing this question, we had a conversation with Giampaolo Scarsati, who is the professional educator coordinator of this recovery collab, who has put a lot of energy to make this lab then actually develop, and then gradually there is a team made of patients, professionals, family members that are actually developing this idea, making it real in a very dynamic way. So the first question was actually to understand if there was any transformation in this care ecosystem. And the first consideration that emerged was that this collab, because it was somehow developed at the end external from the services, it was also somehow less regulated. And this means that it was perceived as more flexible and accessible by both user and local resources, and also open to be transformed and co-evolve via co-design, co-production. So he was talking about the idea that was also really happening this kind of dynamic co-production, this 5-6 months of operation. And in particular, they find themselves activating resources that they were not visible before when they were operating only within somehow the Department of Mental Health, but they became visible and available in a way that was completely open. So somehow the lab was not perceived as a competitor, was not perceived as part of the institutional set, the institutional actors. And somehow this led to opening up more potential for collaboration. They managed to map 94 realities in this kind of dynamic mapping exercise, and then interviewing and interviewing 58 of these realities, and then from this starting to activate possible collaborations. And what is interesting, he was suggesting that this kind of conversations, which were lighter, like in a coffee meeting, or more structured with these interviews and encounters, were helping to activate marginalized resources. For example, a retired gynecologist that was very excited about this opportunity and he's been involved as an expert of affectivity. Or they were able to access a new financial resource and expertise. For example, this Congregational Charity Institute that has resources specifically dedicated to people with severe mental health issues, but were generally focused on helping economically individual people while they're trying to help them understand the importance to fund projects that create the condition for people to actually then reactivate, rejoin society and support their recovery. And the other one is discovering and creating synergy. So, for example, there is cooperative for integration into work for people with disabilities that has the funding and collaboration with industry, but they miss the link with the demand, meaning people with this disability. So they are trying to find a way to host this organization cooperative within the collab to share their expertise, and at the same time creating the link with actually people that have the need and demand for being reintegrated into work. So somehow this lab is working in creating, reorganizing this care ecosystem. But the second question is, are we really, are there any signs that we are affecting the institutional field? And somehow to try to understand this, we look into a concept, which is this idea of proto-institution, which are defined as practices, technology, and rules that are narrowly diffuse and only weakly entrenched, but they have the potential to become widely institutionalized. So they are called institutions in the making, because they have the potential to become full-fledged institution if the social processes that develop can entrench them and they can be diffused throughout an institutional field. So only when they diffuse in other beyond the initial prototype, they can become this kind of proto-institution. And to do this, a fundamental element that is described in this literature is the role of collaboration. Collaboration that is considered as the way to develop new solutions, so the way that actually also co-design work to develop new innovation. But if they remain in the field of the initial project, remains kind of a prototype. If this is adopted beyond the boundaries of the collaborative process, it can become institutionalized in a wider system. So it has the potential to transform institutional fields by acting as an important source of innovation. So if we question if this recovery collab as a prototype is moving beyond the initial collaboration, we can see that maybe it is been working better as a living lab and a community lab, but less as an innovation lab, because it has been very independent for institutional services. This has been motivated also from political reasons, because the project was associated more to a single psychiatrist and less with the full department. When this psychiatry moved out to another region, somehow the balance has changed. So somehow there was a lack of synergy and support from the institutional side, and so somehow there was less impact within the departments of mental health, which is also where, if we want to say, the logic of recovery and co-production are less present. There is an evidence that there is an initial diffusion in territorial collaborations of these new practices, new way of solving problems, and new rules in terms of what is accepted, what is new way of behavior that is acceptable within mental health, but also new understanding of mental health, a new way of thinking about services. But in terms of link with institution, is starting to happen only now, because there is the need to recreate this trust between the collab and healthcare services. And this is happening because the lab once has been launched and one has been coming to the newspaper. There has been different letters coming from also patients to the institutions to raise attention to this lab. And somehow it showed the evidence that this was starting to work. But also in the launch, there has been an interest from the Lombardy region to support this as a prototype of a specific kind of organizational structure that is developing now as part of the National Plan of Recovery and Resilience. There is this concept of community house. The project that should finish at the end of March, there is a potential to develop further thanks to this funding that was achieved by the hospital in Brescia from Lombardy region to define this collab as an experimentation of a community house that is now in discussion by the local board of mental health. So somehow the idea behind this new identity of this collab is to work as a bridge between the territory and the former healthcare services, because healthcare services might have difficulty to accompany people back into the community, but also they have difficulty to see the needs of people and to engage people with mental health needs. So somehow there is this new identity that is also emerging, this collab, to bridge the territory with the former healthcare services. And somehow the idea that this recovery collab should lose the war of recovery and become the collab Torre Cibabue, and hopefully to develop further this role. Ending up this presentation, we can say that there is a clear role that design has played in creating this prototyping process of the collab. And we aim to create this collaborative capacity that somehow lasted in the project. But it was a collaborative endeavor. It was not just design. Of course, as I would say, there was the contribution at different levels from different actors. And the collab rather is developing really as this kind of hybrid model of innovation lab that can really play this transformational role. But our role somehow arrived to the prototype. So the question is how this prototype can become a proto-institution and how can design actually contribute to this process is the question that I was anticipating at the beginning, that somehow is open, and somehow this connects also the journey that Experio Lab has done from a kind of a local prototype to a national policy lab. So I would like to open up the discussion because we are familiar in design with prototyping, but we are maybe less familiar with the proto-institutions, and somehow what is design when we move from this stage to this other stage is still open. Before closing this presentation, I would like also to share a last thing, which is a short video. And then I open up the floor for having a conversation.
Recovery Collab is a territorial lab outside the institutional places of mental health care. It is a space where to educate on a new vision of mental health, which promotes an active welcoming, offering an orientation service to local resources, which promotes co-design practices between users, caregivers, and the territory, and in which users feel comfortable thanks to its informality. The collab hosts a constantly updated mapping of the local resources. These resources are activated according to the needs emerging from users and the neighborhood. This match between resources and needs is the basis of a constant co-design process to support new paths of care and social inclusion. These allow the ecosystem and governance to be rethought together for a community-based psychiatry. The network activated by the collab promotes mental health as a human right and a resource for the community.
Okay, so I think this is the presentation. I'm very happy to receive any question, comment, etc.
I'm just thinking about this proposal that you put forward around proto institutions, and thinking about kind of what that adds to our, more widely used notion of prototype in design. And it made me think when you were talking about this kind of possibility to be more widely institutionalized, like when we're prototyping something, we're often just kind of like seeing whether it works in that context. But it seems like you're kind of like alluding to a different mechanism in which it also reproduces itself or carries forward. So I just wondered your thoughts, whether you felt like in your example, maybe through the through the replication model of the kind of housing, I forget now what it was called, the next iteration of the kind of recovery. Do you feel like there is these mechanisms of kind of reproducing itself or passing it between generations? Because it sounded like you're this kind of lead in charge. It was like a very one person thing, which is limiting the like proto institution kind of idea. But yeah, what mechanisms do you see or could you see to actually work at institutionalizing this further?
Well, I think there are, as we know, the emergent nature of these things, there are different factors that somehow are supporting this potential development. One is the opportunity which is given by this policy, national policy, which is the development of these community houses in Italy, in the territorial level, which is kind of an evolution of another nature of local house, which is the Casa della Salute health houses, with the idea to move more in connection, integration with the community. So when we present and launch the lab, there was people representing somehow the institution, they recognize the value. And because there is a lot of pressure to invest a lot of money in very short time, they try to take this opportunity. And so the fact that somehow something that was a prototype is associated with something supported by a policy create a space and opportunity to become immediately a model for something else. The other thing is connected to the fact that, for example, we try to formalize as much as possible some of these practices. And for example, as part of the project, we are developing a co-evaluation tool, a self-evaluation tool for organizations in their orientation toward recovery and co-production. So we are trying to make this self-evaluation as a mix of co-evaluation and co-design to help organizations that are interested to understand, evaluate where they are in this journey, transformational journey, also adding the idea that not only recovery co-production, but also engagement with the territory, and finding ways to, through this process, understanding what they need to change to get to that transformation. So for example, this idea of formalizing a self-evaluation tool that can travel in different realities and inform transformational pathways is another way to possibly do this. And the other thing is that somehow the transformation might not necessarily have to take the form of a collab, but might take the form of different best practices that are populating this lab. So this is why somehow in Brescia, this experience worked better, because it was already a history of some experimentation with recovery. So this tells about the long co-evolution or long development that this kind of experiences. So if in Brescia there was already some culture somehow around this, in other places everything was new. So even just to make a recovery college was a big deal. And surely the other thing is, like you were saying, this was really associated with the project of one leading psychiatrist, which was then somehow disconnected because some political reason from the original place. And this disconnection caused the difficulty to actually really have an impact in the institution. So I think there are many different dimensions that can affect this kind of evolution, not only in terms of replication, but in terms of recognition as a exemplar model, or as a dissemination of best practices beyond the collab, which the collab is promoting.
I think that's a brilliant answer, Daniela. I think you gave us so many clues around like moving from prototypes to proto institutions, of like connecting with policy, giving people visibility to see where they're at in terms of you know, evaluating, self-evaluating, latching onto existing culture. I think those are really, really helpful for us in thinking about how do we position these things to be more widely institutionalized. So thank you.
I think we have some questions in the chat as well. Will you like to take some of those, Daniela and Serpil?
Thank you so much. I see a question from Aza. My question is about how did you reframe the vision and the mission of the lab? I imagine from the beginning of the co-design process. So I think there was we were surprised somehow that there were at the end some coherence with what we imagined from the beginning. But we were also very clear from the beginning that what we designed at the beginning should not necessarily be what the collab should be at the end, because the idea was that it was this iterative process where the fundamental thing was the collaborative capacity. So what it should become depend on this collaboration. So the most important thing was focusing on this. And so somehow they are aware of this. Actually, it is a value they are promoting, the fact that this process of co-design, co-production, if it's real, needs to lead to a real transformation, not only of the territory, but also of themselves. So this openness is what has been perceived as a value from the territory, which doesn't see this as an imposition, but as an opportunity. So I bring my perspective, I have a resource, you have another resource, we create synergy. Or for example, at the moment, they start to realize that they need to start working for young people, because this was not in the tradition of the department of mental health, which is generally associated with older adults, older adults that have more chronic conditions, while there is a lot of need, as we know also, then in particular in this period, it's becoming more evident to have something also for young people. So this is the demand coming from the territory, and the lab needs to reorganize, redevelop. So somehow the core principle that remains the same is this dynamicity. The only question we have is, once this is recognized as an institutional model and start to be connected back to the departments, there is a fear that the transformation might go back. So I mean, this flexibility, this openness, as we know, if we, I think this was also an issue in the Experio Lab. Now, if the moment you work inside institutions, there is a certain things you can do. The moment you are outside is a different story. So we will see if this bridging role will keep the value and the principles that this lab has been developed for. Sorry, let me just see if there is any. Then Anuka is, thank you, I'm very interested in the feedback reactions you have received from the institution side. As I was saying at the beginning, this collab was almost ignored. And this was the strength. Like we know, the labs are a safe space for experimentation. So at the beginning it was ignored. And then gradually this is again becoming a more interesting prototype, again, because the opportunity has arisen, because it's become not only just a project of someone else or a single person, but a new investment of the department. And so they're starting to recognize the potential, but they need to recreate their ownership to be able to act upon this lab. So somehow at the beginning they were ignoring. There was some interest in the region at the beginning when we presented the project, and now it's coming back. So I would say it depends if they can see the value of the collab also for their own policy development, their own interest. So that's where the collab comes back in visible and potentially relevant. I see Thomas raising your hand.
That you can take the questions first if you want, Daniela.
Okay, I took the last question from Arta, a question about the governance of the lab, how the lab is managed, who decide, and how decisions are made. So the collab has this team of, there is a community manager, there is this coordinator, and there is a team of, a core team of patients, family members, and I think they, and also a local organization that I think they meet weekly to develop the plans of initiatives, activity, and so on. And then there are subgroups that are developing specific activities, so like Recovery College, the dynamic mapping, the ones that are more related to the entertainment and meeting with the external people and so on. So somehow there is a core team and then smaller teams that are activating different parts, and they are coordinating the agenda, and they creating a database with all the people involved and mapped. And somehow in this way it's gradually being populated, and of course they also need to be gradually making more choices in terms of what they do there, because the more they get now attention and interest on, then they need also to be very able to choose what to develop and not, keeping the key principles as their guidance. Thomas.
My head is really blurry and full of reflections and maybe more questions to myself after sort of reflecting on all the good stuff you shared in this presentation. So for me, that says this was a very good presentation. So thank you a lot for that. So I merely think I wanted to share an Experio Lab reflection. And for the ones in the meeting that don't know who I am, my name is Thomas, and I was the initiator of Experio Lab now some 10 years, more than 10 years ago, even though we opened up in 2013. And one little line that I picked up on the way was this, that you cannot sort of design the ecosystem. You can merely sort of create spaces to change it and to make it possible to change itself. You sort of cannot change an ecosystem from by design from the outside. You can sort of help the ecosystem and change it. That's at least how I understood it. So that from that reflection, I was sort of, okay, over the years with Experio Lab, it has had so many phases. It started in one of Sweden's county council as a sort of a prototype that got, of course, since we've been running for 10 years, it's more like an institution. This is a firm part of what this region is doing, but at the same time, the lab is not really there anymore. We're not prototyping as much. Maybe that is coming back a little bit, but sort of when things get more institutionalized, you're also part of that institution that is a part of an ecosystem, and you have a harder time in changing it. And I can see that has happened a little bit in the first region where we started. Then it spread all over Sweden. At one point, it was like 11, 12 regions building their own capacity, building their own labs, and we formed it like a national group of regions doing this together. And I can see the same thing is happening in other regions, that it starts at like a prototype. It gets more institutionalized, and then it sort of lose the possibility to prototype and sort of being more exploring. And but at the same time is good, because when you are part of the institution, you will be there for a long time, and you will have the possibility to replicate that down the line, which I also can see has happened. And that's why we, at this point, being sort of having embedded people, having embedded capacity in different locations in Sweden and working together, that's when we also can offer a possibility for the national governance to prototype and do more policy-oriented explorations. And the things that we are doing is that we are helping the commissions, which is how we frame commissions, is a group of people that are making proposals for new legislations for the future. So they're sort of working through a theme to propose to government on what the new legislations will be. So that's what the commission in the Swedish system is. And then we can connect them directly to regions and municipalities and frontline staff and users and patients and citizens out there, and sort of work together with them, because we have that. So that's where we are going. And from that, I'm thinking sort of, I've started over the last few years sort of always thinking of Experio Lab as I think for us, it's been a constant struggle of being a prototype or being institutions. Kalle, that is moderating this meeting, Kalle and I, we had a discussion just yesterday on one of those national projects that we are in, that we are now heading in, I think, to our 4th year of that collaboration. And we were sort of discussing that. Have we lost what started as a prototype, started from relationships between people being very explorative, now getting into a more institutionalized phase where the conditions to explore is different, the relationship changes more to that we are someone there to just deliver what they demand from us, and we are sort of not making new ways anymore. So I think this sort of maybe that will be the questions, Daniela. So is this institutionalization of things, the institution, is that something that we always should strive for? Is it necessarily of goodness to strive for that?
I think there is maybe a difference between engaging with institutions and being institutionalized, maybe. So it is fundamental for the collab to exist and to have an impact to engage with. And this was the lack of this project. It was good at the beginning, but at the end, somehow, if you want to have any value, any impact, you need to engage with institutions intended as formal health service and so on. So if you want to transform this paradigm of care, you can't just work with the community, because the community is already community, as a community logic. No, the problem is the institution, the health services. So that bridge is an interesting concept. So we're not part, but we're working as a bridge, and we create this collaboration and connections that can inform each other. So because the idea is that the collab should be a place where the individual treatment plans for the users navigate through, so pass through this collab. So the collab creates opportunities for the recovery journeys and work as a bridge. So maybe in this case engage with the healthcare services, might still keep kind of a more independent or experimental space. This is a possibility, and we'll see. In case instead becomes a community house and is more institutionalized, then the risk is that, of course, maybe this place will be hosting also health services, because the community houses should be a hybrid provision. So the nature will necessarily change, and it might become institutionalized in the sense that becomes something entrenched. And but the problem is what institutional logic will inform the institutionalization. So the problem is not if it becomes institutionalized, but if it's informed still in the principles of recovery and co-production. If it's going to lose that, then the institutionalization is a problem, no? So I think that the kind of maybe concerns in this transformation.
Then I have one more reflection, and then maybe goes out to everyone, also the ones that I don't personally know that are a part of this meeting today, where you frame the question as how can design has design something to contribute, or how you frame the question, I can't remember now. And for me, that's pretty obvious, and it's about creating those basis meeting points, labs, prototypes, or whatever we like to call that, because that will be the places where that transformation of the ecosystems, innovations, the co-creation can take place. And sometimes we've been thinking, again, sort of looking to Experio Lab as not as an organization. It's more like how we organize. Sort of there are people behind what Experio Lab is, and sort of looking to, even though it's been going for 10 years now, we sometimes think it's just our prototype to push things forward. And on the way, there are sort of many different projects that we call, okay, we have a year lab for this or a year lab for that, and we can sort of recreate those environments. And that's why I'm aiming that to everyone. I think, there's a lot of people in this group in the meeting that we've met down the line, and we've been doing things together, sort of sharing knowledge between each other on how design can contribute to do that. And I'm thinking that is an important thing that where design is sort of, we as a design community can and are sharing, so we can sort of replicate and do those interventions or create those labs over and over and over and over again. Because some will be more like a fixed organization or an institution, or being embedded in the institutions that they were aimed to, and slowly drown there to become part of the formal organization. But I think we can sort of replicate that all over and over and over again if we look to the group behind it.
Any more reflections in the group, or do we have some? Jusina, you wrote something in the chat here, I see.
It was just an echo to what Daniela said, like amplifying something smart. I love that this kind of question of the reflecting on what logic by which we're institutionalizing things. If it's a community initiative that then gets institutionalized through a professional logic, maybe that matters and actually erodes the original intentions. So just, yeah, really thoughtful.
We have Jonathan, yeah, would you raise your hand? Please come in, Jonathan.
Thank you, and sorry for I was a bit late into your presentation, Daniela, but I think this discussion is interesting. And one of the things that I've been exploring is a different kind of logic for why using labs, in a sense, and not necessarily with a trajectory to make them become institutionalized, but rather as more impermanent structures that kind of seek to support a certain environment or a certain community to actually, develop some service design capacities within themselves, in a sense, and then actually dismount and go away. So the idea was this kind of impermanent embedded design labs that engages with a program of several different interlinked projects, but it's kind of not thought of as something that would eventually develop to become an institutionalized part of the system as such, but just more like as impermanent structures that, let's say, from the very beginning, are thought to be dismounted at some point. And so there's this, this is a different logic related to the institutionalization aspect that I think Thomas was tapping into, where you can imagine such supportive or collaborative structures actually to be designed in a way that is impermanent to begin with, I think. It just offers an alternative to this, maybe, let's say, knee-jerk idea of trying to embed design capacity as a structural thing, rather than a supportive mechanism that at some point may not be needed anymore.
Well, my thoughts, if I can share some thoughts I had during your presentation, is this, and I think we can connect it to Experio Lab as well. While being some kind of design lab that in some way is maybe institutionalized in some case, and I can see that, and I think that was interesting with the presentation as well, and that is how can we manage to change the institutions over and over again, because as I see it, these design interventions we do may also be stuck in some kind of structure that we have designed, and probably as the world is evolving and people are evolving, the design has to be iterative all the way. But when we do a design intervention inside some kind of institution, it's in some way it needs to be finalized as the perfect prototype and then rolled out into the big organizations, and then it gets stuck in maybe an old way to arrange things. Can you understand how I mean? How can we be iterative and inside the institutions? That is my main questions.
So how we can remain, you said, iterative, explorative, experimenting within the institutions. Well, I think if the role of playing that role of being experimental is institutionalized, meaning that somehow it is recognized that your role is that one to, in my case, to work as a bridge, to experiment with the territory. So somehow it's recognized that that is your role, and what is recognized is aligned with your philosophy, so your values. So the moment instead what you're doing, in fact, as a competition, as a problem, as a lack of using resources that should be used somewhere else. So the moment it becomes in competition with other projects, your potential of being taking that role might be maybe limited. So I think that the big challenge to keep that kind of nature is that that role is valued as important contribution or recognized by services as a valuable model to operate within the care ecosystem. Of course, this might be that this happens notwithstanding the fact that in the institution there are other logics, and so things are changing slightly. Maybe it's not changed massively, but still it can play its role in transforming the way recovery and treatment plans are developed. The problem is when maybe instead somehow this way of operating clash with other principles, other values, and then this potential experimenting, this nature is somehow constrained. So it is a concept of a balance, or like Jonathan was saying, of understanding what needs to be built within the health service. And also we need to talk about regulations and so on, because mental health care is also regulated, and there is a lot of discussion about risk assessment. And so the moment you operate outside the organization, maybe there is a positive way of approaching risk. But if you enter within institution with all its regulation of professionals and so on, some practices might lose its potential. I think Yosina is raising your hand.
Yeah, I was just building on some of what you brought up, Kala. I think it made me think about the difference in the ways that we might institutionalize things. So in kind of like an oral tradition of storytelling that's passed on through generations, the story changes every time and it gets contextual and it's shaped to its processes. But if we write a book that stays, then somehow that context, it's fixed. So, but that still can be passed down generations, but then we might not get the retelling that then shifts it into being the core essence or those things. So it just makes me think about, you know, how we do this institutionalization work might matter, and the rigidity or flexibility, finding that right balance in how we're kind of institutionalizing, I think is interesting, just kind of riffing off of some of what you were getting at there.
Thomas?
Yeah, maybe Kalle, I'm taking your role here a little bit, but I'm thinking maybe this is a little bit of an open invitation on and sort of showing where we try to create new knowledge, or feel that at least we have too little knowledge, and would like to make like an open invitation to contribute, and that has to do with sort of how do we prototype or institutions, or the institutionalization, or governance, and those kind of things, where I again go back to the projects that we are doing with the commissions at this point. And especially I'm thinking of a situation that is now passed, so it's gone, but it's going to be in other projects in the future. But we were working with a new legislation for elderly care in Sweden. We had lots of problems around that in the COVID situation. We had lots of deaths in the elderly homes, for instance, and there is probably become a new legislation on the relationships between the healthcare organization and the municipalities, for instance. So we were helping them, and then we were they had some sort of early ideas on what that type of legislation was going to be. And we set up a series of workshops in different regions in Sweden, where we invited the commissioner together with the regions and the municipalities and frontline staff and people, and that sort of patients or citizens, what we like to call them. And of course, I'm thinking that is the situation where we would need to be better at prototyping the institutions that run because the legislation will make way for a new type of institutions, a new way to organize how we work with with elderly care for the future. And I think we did a good job, but also felt maybe that we were lacking a little bit of knowledge and or heading into a situation where we really hadn't been before. So for me, that this was an open invitation for the future be involved in those kind of projects or share knowledge on how do we actually do this.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and nice invitation. And we have Anna who raised her hand. I think that will be the last hand for this this session because the time is almost up, but we have a few minutes left. So please, Anna.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for an interesting presentation, and all of you for an interesting talk. And I'm wondering, I'm throwing in, maybe this is very late to do this, but I'm thinking about, we are discussing about institutions and institution in design, but we are also working in the public sector. It is a highly politically regulated organization. And I'm thinking, where is politics coming in here? And I'm thinking both, yeah, I'd leave it there. So there is time for reactions. Thank you.
So where is the policy here? So the
politics.
Politics. Sorry,
Yeah.
politics. Where is politics here? So it depends how we intend probably politics, because it was full of politics somehow, the project at the micro level, the meso level, the macro level. So then the problem may be that I have to say we were not very good at dealing with politics, and we hand over this to the senior. So whenever the project run into a conflict within politics, often this should be dealt by the senior, I mean the decision makers. So we had also, for example, we were working with an institution which is called REMS, which is a prison for people that have committed crime but have suffering from mental health. And that was super very difficult to work, in particular in a kind of collaborative and external manner. But because there were institutions with very different perspectives, different stories, different practices, the collaboration created a lot of conflicts. But in order to overcome some conflicts, the only way was going back to the funding and to the decision makers, to the directors of the departments that should talk with each other and trying to find. The micro politics maybe is a different, but the macro politics that could create blockage, divergence of the project and so on, those were dealt in mostly in that way, and there was not necessarily always a lot of transparency. So even in this project, which was somehow the size was not necessarily big, but still there were a lot of politics going on. Maybe not always visible, but relevant.
Thank you very much. That was a very good last question, I think, because I think we all just struggle with this question about how much politics do we do and how much design do we do and how much reorganizing of the institution can we do without involving the politics. And that is quite a big question. Maybe it can be some Experio seminar in the future all of this question. Thank you very much, Daniela and Serpil, for this eminent presentation, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning. And please log on to experiolab.se to sign up for the coming Experio seminars, and of course sign up for our newsletter as well. So thank you very much, and have a nice Friday and a nice weekend.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye, everyone.